Hello, and welcome to Independent Thinking, the weekly podcast from Chatham House. I'm Bronwen Maddox, the director, back after a week in the US. Thank you to Ben Bland for hosting last week's discussion on China and its reaction to the US election. Now, leaders from nearly 200 countries attending the COP29 summit have been grappling with two big questions. Who will pay for climate action, and what will the consequences be of the US's likely possible withdrawal from international climate cooperation? Donald Trump has said that he will again pull the US out of the Paris Agreement, the landmark climate treaty, when he returns to the White House next year. This COP has not been without controversy. The economy of Azerbaijan, the host nation, is highly dependent on fossil fuels, the main cause of climate change. Its president told COP delegates that oil and gas are a gift from God, one of those phrases that really hangs there. And while Sir Keir Starmer turned up in Baku, he was one of only two G7 leaders speaking at the summit. Joe Biden, Emmanuel Macron, Olaf Scholz were noticeable by their absence. So the stakes are now enormously high. It's almost certain this year will be the hottest ever on record. It's likely 2024 will be the first time the planet breaches annual average warming of 1.5 degrees over pre-industrial levels, the target set in Paris nearly 10 years ago. And while that doesn't mean the 1.5 threshold has technically been passed, we're already seeing devastating climate impacts, and the 1.5 target was at risk even before the US election. So what can be done, and what has this COP managed to do? Well, I have a brilliant series of guests here. In the case of Roger Harrabin, former BBC journalist, actually sitting beside me. And Roger, you've just done a documentary on all this that we're going to be discussing.
Yes, it looks back on the history of climate change policy, and particularly to the year 2000, when Al Gore lost to George W. Bush in the US presidential election, partly thanks to some apparent dirty tricks. And we look back at that time and project forward. You can find that if you're interested on Archive Hour, and it's called The Year We Lost the Climate.
This is a BBC.
It's a BBC Sounds, yeah.
Really good to have you. Joining me on the podcast from COP itself in Baku is Ruth Townend, the Senior Research Fellow with our Environment Programme here at Chatham House. Welcome, Ruth, and well done on everything you've been doing out there.
Thanks, Bronwen.
Thanks for coming. We can hear, I think, the noise of COP in the background.
Yes, certainly. Lots of people milling around.
And finally, joining us from Brazil is Maria Netto, Executive Director of the Institute for Climate and Society in Brazil, which is involved in the planning for the next COP, COP30 in Brazil. Welcome, Maria.
Thank you. Nice to be here with you.
Really, really good to be talking to you. Well, Ruth, let me start with you on this. Our first question: what has this COP achieved, and the consequences of Trump's re-election? Can you give us a sense of where this COP is likely to get to in its closing discussions?
Well, with not very long to go, I'm afraid it's still very much all to play for at COP29. A new set of negotiation texts were published by the Azerbaijan presidency overnight, and parties have had the morning to engage with those texts. I've just come from a plenary discussion, which the Azerbaijani hosts have named the Kurultai, which is a traditional form of meeting where leaders try to reach consensus and find ways forward. That set the tone for what they're hoping to achieve this morning and into the afternoon. But the signals from parties on their responses to those new texts are not great right now. So sometimes hosts will play a game with the negotiating parties where they publish texts which aren't where anyone wants to get to. And it feels like that might be what's happening now, because there's a lot of opposing options available on the different things that are being negotiated, and parties can see that they're still very far apart. To make that a bit more concrete, the biggest outcome from this COP needs to be an agreement on a new collective quantified goal for climate finance. Essentially, an agreement between developed and developing countries about how developed countries will help their less able counterparts to finance climate mitigation action and adaptation to climate change. And in the text published this morning, there's still no agreement even on the scale of the need, let alone what richer countries are willing to provide. So the presidency is asking parties to put their cards on the table. How much money are they willing to give? Until that happens, it's difficult to see how things will move forward.
Let me just ask you on this point about climate finance, because this is supposed to be the big subject of this COP, when this question of finance, who pays for it, gets real. Is there any progress that has been made, not just in the past few days, but in this year of discussion since the last COP on precisely this point?
Well, the scale of the need has been more clearly defined, at least by developing countries. I think everyone understands that that scale is in the trillions, not in the billions. So there was a previous symbolic goal of exactly 100 billion US dollars to be delivered annually from developed to developing countries over the last 5 years, and that goal wasn't met. But this goal is different. It needs to be based on the actual needs of developing countries. And that 1.3 trillion figure, that does seem to be something that might be settled upon. However, there has been a lot of research around the goal and also the returns that developed countries could expect to see from providing that type of climate finance. So a paper that's being circulated this morning from Professor Patrick Bolton shows that that investment would be returned to developed countries multiple times over in terms of the economic returns they could expect to see by providing investment to their trading partners in developing countries, and also by preventing disasters which would be costly to address through disaster relief.
Roger, you've been following this for a long time. What do you make of this year's discussions?
I've done COPs off and on since the start, actually, or since the first one after Kyoto. And it struck me then, and it strikes me now, that it's kind of inevitable that we would get to this place. When it was first proposed that all nations of the world would come together, melding in a way of shaping all their economies to one goal, that looked unrealistic, probably impossible. And I think over the years, we have proved year after year. I know we shout at the politicians and we're angry with them, so civil society is angry with them, but actually there feels like an inevitability about it, unfortunately. And when you hear a phrase like fossil fuels are a gift from God, I mean, my first gut response was absolute revulsion. What a thing to say. And my second response was, well, hang on a second. The US has treated its fossil fuels as a gift from God and wants to continue doing so.
Liquid gold is Trump's phrase, I think.
Liquid gold, exactly. We in the UK, we've mined all our coal, we've drilled all our oil, and we've sucked out nearly all of our gas. And we're still asking other people in developing countries, if they're sitting on large amounts of fossil fuel, as the Azeris are, oh no, actually, you can't do that. We've done that, but you can't
So that
do
is
it.
a clear injustice point, which has driven a lot of these arguments at COP about who is going to pay for not just the mitigation, but trying to change the behaviour of the world. But do you see any progress? I'm not pushing you for the answer yes, but I have in mind Bill Gates, who are now very much working in this area, sitting on the Chatham House stage some months ago, saying, look, I do think there is a seriousness about governments, at least about recognition of the problem that there wasn't 10 years ago. Would you say there has been a change in seriousness?
Yes, there has been. And it's instance in the figure we just heard, the trillions figure. And previously we were hedging around in billions, unpaid billions. And now even the fact that talk is there of trillions and it's treated seriously does signify that we are into a more serious stage. But, the climate, unfortunately, as we labour along, the climate is galloping away.
And we're into a much more serious stage of that, as we can see in all kinds of events. Maria, what is your take on this particular COP and the money question, if I can put it that way, because there have been discussions over the years, and perhaps countries that didn't acknowledge the seriousness of the problem now do, but we're up against this money question.
I think the convention itself, let's say when it was developed and, back then in the 90s, had one kind of scope, let's say that was very focused when we talk about finance on a more traditional ODA, development cooperation kind of perspective. And what happened over the years is to understand that climate change is actually something that has a clear economic impact. So when we were talking back then about billions, a lot of the focus was about the ODA and technical cooperation and financial assistance in a more traditional point of view. Whereas when we are talking today about the types of investments needed, it's about shifting the development pathways of economies. I think this is a bit the problem of the convention itself, because the framework of the convention is not really appropriate for this conversation that is the one we need to have, which goes beyond just the obligation of indeed these developed countries to support particularly the ones that have lower income and more difficulties. And in this case, it's not just about the mitigation to climate change. What is happening is that the cost of inaction, or so the cost of not actually addressing climate change, is hitting us already. No? So I think the perception of the trillions is because we actually just last year lost about 80 billion in natural disasters caused by climate change. We know this tendency is going to grow over time. More than half were not insured of those losses. And so that means what? That there is economic costs that are already happening in all economies. But clearly for developing countries, and particularly for the most vulnerable that have also fiscal problems, this is even higher. So I think there is a bit of a disconnect and a difficulty on this conversation on finance, because the convention kept the conversation very much about this north-south important obligation of the, what we call common but differentiated responsibilities, like the historical responsibility. But the real world is about something else, no? It's about the real costs and the need for shifting investments largely. And so that's a bit the question. Is the convention the place for discussing this?
I just want to tease that out a bit more. That is fascinating what you're saying, because we have, Roger set out, and you've just referred to the obligation, which much of the North recognises, certainly acknowledges the historic contribution of industrialized societies to the climate change that has happened. That's pretty much without dispute, except in some corners of politics. But then you get to the lament of the rich world at the moment. Well, we have loads of debt for all kinds of reasons, and we have aging populations we have to look after, and we just don't have the money, and we tax our people an awful lot. I'm sitting in a country that is wrestling with how to find more bits of tax, and so there's this lament, which may not get much sympathy around the world, of we just don't have the money. What is the response to that?
I think it's not just about the amount of the money. So obviously in the convention, the amount is important because of this traditional and important obligation thing, but it's also about the quality, the access to the money, how efficiently the money is coming to people, and how the money is mobilizing resources, because one thing or not, about 70% of the investments needed to address climate change come from private sector. No?
We've gone into the money question, as I've called it, quite a bit, because that is what this COP is about. But Ruth, I wonder if you could just help us take a step back for a moment and say, if there is not much progress on all this, what are the consequences? What is at stake for the climate?
So the consequences are deeply, deeply concerning. We are, as you said, Bronwen, in your introduction, getting very close to the 1.5 threshold if it has not already been passed. And that threshold sounds like a small thing, half a degree, doesn't make much difference in a day. But over the scale of the planet's climate, the most concerning element is that we're nearing tipping points in the stable systems that allow us to grow food, allow us to thrive, our economies to thrive. And if things like the ocean's currents change, they can create massive shifts in how our climate feels, in our growing season length. And we really do depend on the Earth. It's our life support system, to say it in very basic terms. So the UN has defined this decade as a crucial decade for climate action. And that's because if we pass those thresholds within this decade, it will be very difficult to turn back the clock on that. And our carbon emissions will continue to have an impact after we reduce those emissions and reach net zero. There will be a lag on those impacts. So it really can't be overemphasized how everyone needs to pull their weight as much as they possibly can in global climate action. And at the moment, we're still sort of quibbling over who will pay and how much. And those are really important discussions. But the urgency of it, although people make reference to it all of the time, it needs to drive real action.
Roger, your take on the significance of Trump's re-election makes a big difference, or as some people say, actually not so much for all the sound and fury and liquid gold?
Well, we were heading towards breaching the 1.5 limit, as we just heard from Ruth. Unless it's been breached already, it has to be taken over a decadal timescale, so it's impossible to pin it down to, okay, we breached it this year. We won't find out whether we breached it or not for sure for another decade or two. And the problem is, in these circumstances, when you have really terrifying results of climate change, which I'll share one with you. In Lytton, in Canada, 2 summers ago, there was a fire which razed the entire town. There had been historic high temperatures, so high that they were 5 Celsius higher than the previous record. I mean, this is really shocking. Normally, temperature rises would be calibrated for records in a quarter of a degree, maybe a half a degree or something. 5 degrees, absolutely incredible. So I phoned the head of climate science at the Royal Society, Professor Sir Brian Hoskins, and said, have you seen this result in Lytton? And he said, what? And I said, if it's 5 degrees above the record. And he said, no, that must be a mistake. So I said, no, it's not a mistake. I thought it was a mistake. I phoned the Met Office. The Met Office say it's not a mistake. Anyway, this is the most significant comment I heard from that. It was a non-comment, because when I said that to him, I counted 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then he said, oh my God. Okay, this is a respected physicist, not normally prone to exaggerating in an emotional way, who just can't cope with that sort of knowledge. You'll find the same from the British Antarctic Survey or any of the researchers. Although there's still quite a lot of uncertainty about exactly what will happen, it's really, really bad. Now, to have somebody elected into the White House with this going on in the physical world is absolutely incredible. If society exists in 200 years' time, they'll look back, historians, and think, what on earth were they doing? They had a large fire, so they deliberately voted to chuck petrol on it. It's absolutely incredible. So it is huge from that point of view. It gives cover to Saudi Arabia and other naysayers in the talks. So it's really significant from that point of view. As to what happens in the USA, that's a different matter. And there may be some not quite so negatives coming out of it.
Particularly at the state level, I think, is the
Yes.
point that many of the states are now rushing to say of the federal government in the US does not determine everything that the US does. Maria, just on this point, Trump, big symbolic blow to climate talks and so on, given his stance. But in reality, does it make a big difference what the US does?
It does, because obviously it's one of the largest global emitters, and I think also the denying kind of situation doesn't help also in a moment of what Ruth was saying, is a huge urgency. We're getting close to tipping points. So, have one of the largest economies in the world backpedaling doesn't help. Now, it is interesting to think that he was elected by people. So we need also to reflect what that means. If this is a kind of cultural reaction to many other trends, but we need to tackle the future with this sense of urgency, thinking what can we do to engage also these deniers, because that's a bit, I think, what needs to be for us a reflection. How come that the people don't understand there is this urgency? How we engage those people in this dialogue?
It's a really good point, Maria, and also Roger, about the kind of democratic remit that has led to Trump being elected. So the fact that people aren't necessarily aware of the level of risk that they face from climate change, they aren't aware of the economic disbenefits that will come their way as a result of, for example, in the US, pursuing expansion of fossil fuels, which could result in a lot of stranded assets as the rest of the world moves towards more sustainable economies. Those consequences, they need to be made clearer, but it's difficult to see who will do it when civil society is already very vocal on this issue. But I think it is an important element for the populations to understand the crisis that we face so that they can vote accordingly.
Ruth, thanks for that. I'm just pausing as you're talking, because I do get a bit uneasy when people say that voters' behaviour is because of ignorance. Sometimes clearly it might be, but sometimes it may be a choice, and we have to recognise that as well. Just before we swing to talk about the future and COP30 next year, Roger, you were saying as we were sitting down, we must talk about John Prescott and the news of his death, former Deputy Prime Minister in Britain, but many other things, including environmental roles. That's just been announced today. And you and I saw him much in action. What was it you most wanted to remember of that?
There are a few things. I mean, he was an absolute giant physically and intellectually. Although not credited for that, probably because he was northern working class and maybe dyslexic. Anyway, whatever the reasons were, he was stupendous. And he went to Kyoto, sat down with the Americans. One of his aides told me, sat down with the Americans.
Just tell everyone which year that was.
27 years ago, I think, when my son was born.
1997.
1907.
Thank you. And he sat down at the desk opposite the Americans. Apparently 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning. Everybody was exhausted, as they do get in these talks. And Prescott was there. He's a great bull of a man, huge chest, great belly. And he was leaning over the table and just thumping on the table, shouting at the Americans. And eventually they gave way. And the Kyoto Protocol was born. And unfortunately, the US Senate didn't ratify it. But Prescott played this massive part. And also, he understood more than politicians at the time how much the environment was central to all government policy. So he created a super department so the environment would be factored in. He stopped new roads being built into cities because he said cities were congested enough and air pollution was bad enough. And then he went, very memorable to me and would need another podcast to tell the full story. I went diving with him in the Maldives in order to show the extent of the damage caused by global warming on oceans. I'd put him at severe danger, but I think that's probably one for another time.
One for another time. An amazing image. He did get criticised for his roads policy and optimism because, in fact, British roads got more and more snarled up. But we're not going to review all that. But thank you for that. Right, let's swing forward to next year. COP30 in Brazil, and many, many people who've been a bit dismayed about this COP have been more hopeful about next year's. There's a big buzz about it. Many more people and companies already planning to go there. Maria, can you take us just into what the expectations are of next year?
Well, next year is very important because it's the year where we'll be achieving 10 years from Paris Agreement, where we were supposed to have done a lot to stabilize the greenhouse gases level in the atmosphere and also the temperature, which we did not, right? So that's a bit of the stock taking that took place last year in Dubai with some recommendations of things that need to be done quickly. So next year, we will be looking at the next 10 years. And with just what we were discussing, like we are close to tipping point, and we need to recognize that we are not able to do what we promised we would do back in 10 years ago. So it's a very important moment because it's the moment where we are going to be thinking about, and then what, how we can take this sense of urgency and to get a look at the next 10 years. Is also very important because every country is supposed by February to come with their new commitments with regards to the next 10 years. And in aggregate, we will have to see whether these commitments from every country will really be enough to keep the ambition of the 1.5 degrees, or if we are very much far away from it. We know today the trend is not looking so good. So in terms of the atmosphere, Baku is very important to at least give some kind of trust among the countries and lift a bit the ambition of the countries, which unfortunately is not really what is happening.
We had an intervention earlier today. The EU called a press conference along with other countries, including the UK, around high ambition, nationally determined contributions. So pushing for those high ambition national climate plans for next year, which is supposed to be submitted, as you say, in February. But I think the vital link is, again, going back circularly to the finance. That finance is needed for developing countries to produce those ambitious climate plans. So it's a chain. Baku needs to not break it. So everything crossed that a strong NCQG will enable a strong COP30 next year.
Just take people into what that little bit of jargon means.
Which one?
The final declaration.
Oh, the NCQG. So it's a chain. Baku needs to not break it. The new collective quantified goal on climate finance, this new global finance goal, is needed to enable developing countries to submit those strong climate plans for a successful COP30 next year.
And so what is it realistic to expect of COP30?
I think we have to see what comes out of this COP. But I think that sense of urgency, the growing incidence of extreme weather events, there is a strong momentum here. It's just a case of parties overcoming their differences and their own national challenges to be able to bring things to the negotiating table. I feel like there is a groundswell of ambition, but just whether that can actually deliver, I don't know. I'd be interested in your views, Maria.
I think that we are still very far away to know what is going to happen. Also, in terms of national ambitions, frankly speaking, I don't think we are going to see much other than some leading countries. So we have Europe, we have UK, Brazil already presented its NDC, and we may expect actually China to come with actually an ambitions NDC. But there are important countries at the table other than US, okay? Russia, India, and others that are high emitters as well. So there are questions about how the aggregate of those larger emitters will or not be enough for this raising ambition. But we, as Ruth said, maybe, and that's the hope, the sense of urgency may bring us to maybe a more set of realistic, implementable targets, because also the problem back in 2015 is maybe that the countries had targets, but they didn't have the means for implementation. And so the hope is that COP30 can also come with more clear understanding of what targets are, whatever they are, that these targets are really implementable and that we are going to start seeing action and things that are concrete on the ground and not just promises, right?
That's a really interesting point, Maria. And also you tucked in the point about China. Do you think China sees the US stepping back from this zone as a way to give itself more of a role?
I don't know if US is stepping back, but they have been taking more of a role because for them, in a way, they took a decision back already to be turning their matrix and the energy to the renewables kind of pathway, mainly because of national domestic reasons and so on. But still, they are actually benefiting from this kind of trend. And also, probably they may become more proactive. And I can talk about Brazil. Xi Jinping was just here yesterday, and we just finished the G20 here. And China has just left with 37 agreements with Brazil. And the relationship of China was very much reinforced this year. And I think obviously, they invited Brazil to become part of the Belt and Road, and Brazil did not accept because Brazil wants to be neutral. But clearly, they are much more proactive because US is kind of retracting themselves, no?
It's something that we cover a lot in Chatham House's work at the moment of how global rules and norms are rebalancing.
Yeah, I just want to have a word on China. I think this current situation with Trump coming in poses some interesting questions because the Chinese, as we know, have predicated their long-term economic development on renewables, batteries, EVs, the whole electrical low-carbon gamut. Now, let's suppose the US decides to slap 80% tariffs on these things going into the USA. Then how is China going to respond? Well, there are a number of different ways. And one of them may be to decide to continue its progress of making all this ultra cheap stuff, which is getting cheaper all the time, and not being able to sell it into America and having a massive glut of it, which may sound awful, but it would do a lot of good in developing countries to get some ultra cheap renewables. And that might be one of the outcomes. And I think it's really important when we look at the COP process, it gets loads of headlines, but actually the whole economic and political world is involved in this and affected by it in different ways. And so there's lots at play, not just what's in COP.
This is such an interesting point, and I'm not going to divert this whole podcast on it, but I was talking a lot about it in New York last week, hearing people trying to estimate what the effect of subsidies on Chinese goods and Chinese green goods would be, but also whether Trump might not put into action all of the Inflation Reduction Act subsidies, American subsidies for its own green technology, and whether that might give Europe a bit more breathing room to develop its own rather than lose those industries to the States. That's a whole other discussion. Let me just ask just a tiny bit about the UK. Ruth, you mentioned it's there. We've got this under the new government, the newish government, the very strong green commitments. Is that having much effect in the discussion?
Yeah, so the UK is very clearly trying to re-establish itself as a global climate leader. It's come in very strong with an excellent NDC, National Climate Plan, which has essentially set the bar for other countries. Also, the UK's Ed Miliband has been appointed as part of a ministerial pair, which is a couple of ministers who are asked to, I don't want to say bang heads together, but bring people to the table to try to find agreement where it's difficult to get it. He's been appointed with Anna Tony from Brazil as a ministerial pair for the overall balanced outcome of COP29. So the UK is doing very well at re-establishing itself as a climate leader here and stepping into the void left where the US often takes some leadership.
Roger, briefly, do you think the Labour government can stick to its commitments?
I think that's a very interesting question. I've known Ed Miliband for a very long time. He takes this deeply seriously. He's not just a come-and-go politician on this. He's absolutely convinced that the world is in peril and the UK must do what it can in order to mitigate that. However, I met Keir Starmer at COP last year and said to him, will you be able to hold your green policies in place? Because they were under relentless attack from right-wing media as being unrealistic. And he said, yes, definitely. We won't water down. And then 2 weeks later, he watered down because he just, the stick was just too much. Now, we can see already that politically, the new opposition is far more climate sceptic than the previous opposition, which in turn was more sceptic than the one before. There's been a long consensus in the UK, which has now been breached. And there is this relentless flood.
It seems to me, sceptic of climate change or even of the effects of the people's willingness to whether the policies are the right ones and people's willingness to pay for them.
Yeah.
Another subject again in itself. All right, we're coming right to the end. Let me ask each of you whether you find in all of this any strand of optimism. We make it slightly easier by looking ahead at the next year or so. I don't think any of us are arguing with the trends in the climate that we have been discussing. Ruth?
I do try to find optimism in it. And I think seeing all of the people at COP who are so committed and working in very different ways towards strong climate outcomes is always heartening. So yes, in the community around climate change, that's where I find my hope.
Maria?
I think there is a lot of things happening, of course, not at the path and the way we would love to happen, but looking at Brazil, for example, the amount of discussion about the importance of nature-based solutions, the need to think about new technological pathways, rethinking the way our economy and development can be, let's say, structured so that it creates also job opportunities, productivity associated to climate, recognition that climate is an economic issue. I do have this side of the optimism that we will be able to see some kind of movement. The question is if this is going to be enough.
Well, the incredible fall in the price of solar panels has to give a degree of optimism. In some places now it's cheaper to install solar panels than fencing. I mean, nobody ever projected that. But just imagine Jimmy Carter had won the election and been allowed to keep the solar panels on the top of the White House and keep his 2-decade research and development project. Just imagine where we would be now. And that's the problem. We are getting there. It's just we can't go quickly enough. And so just in terms of individuals, people like my other two colleagues here and loads and loads of other people in the environment have to find some way of retaining enough optimism so they feel it's worthwhile continuing to campaign on the future of the planet.
I've got a Lego model of the White House in my office. I might go and stick some solar panels on it out of Lego.
Bit of tinfoil.
Roger, you were telling us just as we all sat down that you'd just come back from a retreat for despondent environmentalists.
Yes, yeah. I mean, I have been very, very gloomy about this, and my wife just gets fed up of me talking about it and being gloomy. So I've mentioned this to a colleague who said, have you been to Plum Village? And I said, no, what's Plum Village? And Plum Village is apparently a monastery, a Buddhist monastery in south central France, where once a year they have a week for people who are battered by working in the environment. And I said, okay, I'll go do that. And it was wonderful, long periods of silence, lots of meditation, qigong with the monks, although I pulled a hamstring playing ultimate frisbee with some of the younger monks, which is probably one to remember. But the key message for me that came out of it was, I will continue to do stuff about the environment, but I will be of good cheer. I will not bore my friends and family by talking about it all the time. And it's incumbent upon me to be cheerful.
Roger, thank you for that. We are going to have to stop there. A huge, huge thanks to my guests, Maria Netto, Ruth Townend, battling the hubbub of COP in the background, and Roger Harrabin. Do follow them all on X and other social media, and you can find all the details in the show notes, and you can find Chatham House on many social media platforms. If you want to hear more from Ruth about the things we've discussed, on Monday she's taking part in a Chatham House Question Time event for our members on what has COP29 achieved. And next week too, we hold our 10th annual Europe Strategic Choices Conference in Berlin with some great speakers, some of that obviously on Ukraine, but some of that on Europe's own difficulties in holding itself together as it addresses many of the questions in the world, including how to respond to China. Great speakers. For details of those events and all our analysis on all these things and all the things that Ruth and team have been doing, head to chathamhouse.org. A reminder also that you can listen to all the episodes of this podcast on all the major podcast platforms. So please do like, follow, subscribe, and tell your friends. For now, that's it from me, Bronwen Maddox. See you next week.